So welcome, everybody. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Peter van Nuffelen, who is professor for the cultural history of the ancient world at Ghent University. Peter trained in history, philosophy, and patristics, and obtained his PhD from KU Leuven and PhD in history. Before coming to Ghent in 2009, Peter held postdoctoral positions in Leuven and Exeter, but also several fellowships, not just in Oxford, Paris, Heidelberg, and so on. He also won several prizes. For instance, he is a laureate for the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium for the Science and Art, and he also won the Prix Francoumont. His areas of expertise are ample, and he published extensively on the history of religions in the underworld, or late antique historiography, cultural history of late antiquity, and so on. Among his publications, I will only mention the most recent books. So the book Jordanes Genetic and Romana and the Fragmentary Latin History of the Late Antiquity, both co-authored with Lil van Hoof, and the book Pensée la tolérance de l'Antiquité tardive, 2018. But Peter is also the co-editor of the Clavis Historicorum Antiquitatis Posterioris and the co-author with Lieve of the volume The Greek Fragmentary Chronicles after Eusebius that is forthcoming for Cambridge University Press. And today, Peter will give us a sneak peek into this book because he will present a paper entitled Andreas, the brother of Magnus and his chronography, towards a new history of Greek chronicle writing. Peter, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind invitation and introduction, and it's a great pleasure to speak here, also because one of the conveners of the seminar is Andy Hilkens, who is almost the co-author of this work, because as you will see, this not so mysterious, or I hope after 20 minutes time, this not anymore so mysterious Andreas Andy spent a lot of work on retrieving and finding Armenian fragments that mention this Andreas, to the point that I can safely say that the book has been delayed for over a year because Andy kept on finding new fragments. And I will share my screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, hang on, is this the correct presentation, or are you seeing my split screen again?
We're still seeing the please, Georgia.
Working mode.
Okay, so this.
Yes, no, it's great. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I want to start by saying that what I'm going to present is really a bird's eye overview of one particular author in this forthcoming edition, and the edition we could only have done this through the collaboration of a range of people, and especially for Andreas. The help of Andy was absolutely crucial, and I also want to signal that Stephanie Pambakian and then checked or did the double check of the translation from the Armenian, because the author I'm going to talk about, Andreas, is a Greek chronographer writing in or who published his work in 353, but who was only attested in mainly the Armenian tradition and just a bit in the Syriac. And the recovery and the reconstruction of this author has a couple of important implications for how we think Greek chronicle writing developed after Eusebius. So that's why I'm going to start by giving a few preliminaries very briefly about Eusebius and his predecessors. We'll then sketch what we think we know or have been able to reconstruct about Andreas and his work. And then in a third section, I will briefly talk about the transmission which starts at the end of the 6th century. So this is really a bird's eye overview. I will have to go very quickly. I have been hesitating between either focusing on a couple of these fragments, which throw up a lot of problems, or giving you an overview. I settled for the second option. Things that you probably know, so the two main predecessors of Eusebius in the writing of chronicles, Julius Africanus and Hippolytus, so in the first half of the 3rd century, both write chronographies, and here just very briefly a matter of definition. So a chronicle, a chronicle is the sort of the proto-denomination for everything that has to do with a form of history writing that has a focus on time, on let's put it that way, and it can, there are two sort of main subgenres. One is the chronicon, and that's the year-by-year list of entries that are best typified in Jerome. So in year 10 of Augustus, this and this happened, in year 11 that happened. Chronography is a collection of materials that have to do with the reckoning of time. Typically, it's king lists, etc. So the first half of the Chronicle of Eusebius is a chronography with all these king lists according to various nations. Africanus and Hippolytus, so they write chronographies until their own day. And I'm highlighting just a few aspects of their work that will be important later on. So the incarnation date, as you can see, all around 5,500, which was a symbolic date, which could be rooted in certain biblical passages. The size of the ark could then be made to as a prefiguration of the symbolic date. So Christ is born in the middle of the 6th millennium. Typical for Julius Africanus is this attempt to integrate biblical and pagan chronologies, which will be a feature for Christian chronography later on, but it throws up a certain set of problems to which we will come. And important for Hippolytus is that his chronicle also has a brief mention to an Easter cycle, or his chronography seems to rely on assumptions about the Easter cycle. I know I am stepping here into a debate about the two Hippolytus and so on, but I'm just leaving that aside for a moment. Eusebius of Caesarea, the big innovator in traditional accounts. So he writes a chronography and a chronicle, and Eusebius does a few things that are really peculiar. First of all, he doesn't start with creation, but only with Abraham on the with the argument that time, the reckoning of time before Abraham is uncertain. He clearly takes his distances from, say, the symbolic readings of the incarnation date. So he settles for 5,098, 198. So simply based on his reckoning of time. In terms of the use of the Bible, Eusebius accepts the Septuagint as the authoritative tradition, but he checks it with the Hebrew Bible, which as a consequence has that he has left out one of the biblical patriarchs, and that will be corrected later on. And what Eusebius explicitly does not do is connecting his chronography with the reckoning of the Easter cycle. Now, Eusebius is rightly known as a sort of not just the father of ecclesiastical history, but also the father of chronicle writing. Something that I will nuance by focusing on Andreas. And the first real innovator after Eusebius is then traditionally said to be Marianna, who integrated the Alexandrian Easter cycle and chronography, which, and what does this integration mean? It means that he calculated that the beginning of creation is the beginning of an Easter cycle of 532 years, and then throughout history this cycle returns, and this 500, the cycle of 532 years is also a point of reference within his chronography. Annianus focuses very much on aspects of regularity. The 25th of March is the date of creation, but it's also the date of the Annunciation, which as a consequence has that 25th of December is the date of birth. So this regularity is very important. And he readopts the year 5500 for the incarnation. So he returns to Julius Africanus. Now, Andreas, the figure of Andreas helps us to nuance a bit traditional accounts of the reception of Eusebius, which tend to stress the innovation and the impact of Eusebius, which is right. But if you look at the figure, for example, like Andreas, you see that in the century after Eusebius, what is going on is that on one hand, people will look at Eusebius, but on the other hand, they will try to recuperate things that they found in Africanus and Hippolytus, but did not find in Eusebius, like, for example, the Easter cycle. So Annianus, in this respect, appears less of an absolute innovator than earlier thought. Okay, now really very quickly, what do we know about Andreas? So Andreas is known for having drawn up an Easter list of 200 years. That is, so you have Easter cycles, a typical 19-year cycle. So recurring, a tool that helps you to calculate the date of the first full moon of the spring, and then Easter is on the Sunday that follows it. But a typical tool for determining Easter dates in late antiquity was not, or for ordinary bishops, was not a list, but not a cycle, but a list. So a calculation of dates, of Easter dates for particular years. And so Andreas calculated one from 353 onwards until the middle of the 6th century. And that's based on an adaptation of earlier cycles, basically that of Anatolius of Laodicea. And we have attestation that this goes hand in hand with the drawing up of a table. There is one Armenian fragment which assigns 17 columns to it, but many of the Armenian fragments incorporate later additions, so that's not entirely certain. And so these columns would typically have, so you would have the date of 14 Nisan, but then also the date of Pentecost, the date of the beginning of Lent, whether the year was a bissextile or not, etc. Andreas is firmly located in the area of Antioch in Syria. He polemicizes against the Syrians about the Easter date. We'll see that in a minute. But he also uses the Antiochene era, which starts in 48 BC. So interestingly, by starting a list in 353, so that's exactly in the 401st year of the Antiochene era. Now, Andreas does a few things that are interesting. First of all, he doesn't seem to know Eusebius, or does the fragment at least do not show any sign of it. His incarnation date is odd, odd, it's unique. It's 5600, which clearly implies that he was not thinking about millennialist speculations, because that would have meant that he saw the, if he would have, then the 6000th year would have been in around 400 AD, so within 50 years, but there's no sign that he was concerned by that. And the only predecessor that we know that he used beside Anatolius for the Easter cycle is Hippolytus. Just to give you a bit of flavor of the material we're looking at, so this is the beginning of, so the most important fragments that we have are the description of the Easter table, and that is preceded by a very traditional polemical discussion of the Easter date. And Andreas clearly targets the Syrians. And these are quartodecimans, so people who celebrate Easter on the 14th of Nisan, so following Jewish practice. And much of that treatise is made up with fairly classical polemic against the Jews, including biblical references, as you can see. But interestingly, he also building or transforming a story that occurs elsewhere in the literature on the Easter date. He points to the Samaritans as the ones who, so when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, who received the true tradition about the calculation of the Easter date or Passover date, and who then transmitted it. And so the Jews of his own time are actually not following true tradition anymore. And this fragment then continues, and I'm just giving, this is the fragment that gives the 17 columns, only giving you the first 3. So the one column would then give the bisextile, the second, the number of years of the Antiochian era. And here you can see that this is an interpolated version, because Andreas would not have counted until the middle of the 11th century. And then the third canon is one that recurs, and that ties in with something that I said earlier about Annianus. So the idea of regularity. So the third column demonstrates that every year, the 17th of March, the 7th of April, and the 6th of January take place on the same day of the week. And this is used by Andreas as an argument to show that that his system is correct. And so the 17th of March is the date of creation. The 7th of April would be an Annunciation, and 6th of January is the date of birth of Christ. It's a week regularity because it's only weekdays, but nevertheless, it is a form of regularity. So it shows that this argument is already there. Another passage from, so a fragment also from the 11th century, just to give you a flavor of some of the things that are happening in the transmission. So in this fragment, a couple of the individuals occur that I will talk about later. Hieron comes later. And so here, the incarnation date of 5600 is attributed to Eusebius, and what is attributed to Andreas is actually the incarnation date of a person called Aias, to whom I will come also in a minute when talking about the transmission. So there is, so the Armenian tradition is absolutely crucial in reconstructing the Andreas, but it is also one that shows up certain difficulties. So his system, incarnation, so, well, Annunciation on the 7th of April, probably 4 or 3 BC, so not entirely sure whether what the exact dates are, that but it's around this date. Passion in AD 30. And as we have seen, so he adopts the 6th of January as the date of birth of Christ. So and this is actually the, as far as I know, the earliest explicit attestation of this date, which is exactly contemporary with the earliest explicit attestation of the Christmas celebration in Rome on the 25th of December. And that's also interesting because we have, we're not entirely sure where the 6th of January comes from. It usually is assigned to Alexandria because Epiphanius says so. But here we have somebody from the Syria who actually defends this date. Okay, very briefly, transmission. Andreas writes in 353, and then for almost 2 centuries we don't hear anything about him. And the Armenian sources have a particular narrative to which I will can come in a minute. And okay, bringing together lots of different pieces of evidence, I think we have been able to reconstruct the following narrative, namely that Andreas is rediscovered in the middle of the 6th century in the context of debates about the date of Christmas, which have to do with Justinian's orders to relocate the feast of the Hippolytus Day, which implies the basis of that is a different Christmas date, so not the 6th of January as was celebrated in Jerusalem at that moment, but the 25th of December. And the conflict clearly is very acute in Jerusalem because they do not immediately follow on the orders of Justinian. And what seems to have happened is that both sides in the dispute, so the side of Justinian and then the Church of Jerusalem, that they have started to draw on chronographic arguments. And two figures are opposed to each other. Hieron, who stands on the side of Justinian, and then Aias, who is on the side of Jerusalem. And both sides, and that's really interesting, in a way rediscover earlier texts that serve their arguments, because this is not just a period that Andreas is rediscovered. This is also the moment that Ammianus is rediscovered. Just a brief parenthesis on that. So it usually is assumed that Ammianus, writing around 412, had an immense impact on chronography in the late Roman Empire from the 5th century onwards. Now, if you start looking at the sources, there is virtually no evidence for reception of Ammianus before the period I am talking about, so the middle of the 6th century. And we know for certain that Hieron, his Easter cycle and his chronography is an adaptation of Ammianus, and the same is true for Aias in relation to Andreas. So actually, both sides drew on these earlier sources to make the argument. That means that the Andreas that is received in the Armenian tradition is seen through the lens of the reworking by Aias. So it seems likely that a dossier with Andreas, but also Aias and some other text was transferred to Armenia, which was then sort of the only church to stand out against, or to stand up against Justinian, so to speak. So Andreas in the Armenian tradition is also always connected to the conflict between Hieron and Aias. And that is significant for other reasons, because the reworking of Aias of Andreas leads to, or becomes the reference point for the origin of the Armenian era. So it has serious consequences for Armenian time reckoning, which is also the reason why there is so much material on Andreas in Armenian. In the Syriac tradition, Andreas is also attested, but very sporadically. Most importantly, there are some passages cited from this treatise on Easter by Elias of Nisibis, but there is not connected to Hieron and Aias. So it's clearly that the Syriac tradition does not derive from this conflict. Okay, very briefly to give you a sense of the narrative that the Armenians create about Andreas. So they have the narrative that in 552 the list of Andreas ends, and they connected this with the idea that the cycle of Andreas was not really exact, that there were errors in it. Now, there are no errors in the cycle of Andreas, but the cycle of Andreas is slightly different from what will become the basic Armenian Easter cycle. So they identify that difference as errors on the part of Andreas. And then the correction of Andreas by Aias is actually the introduction of the 532-year cycle, which is better, which is more more precise than the 90-year cycle that underlines Andreas. Well, it's easier to use. Well, we can talk about that in the discussion later on. And so then Arias comes up, and so he produces this 532-year cycle, which involves a few adjustments to the system of Andreas. It involves also another incarnation date, but it's by and large an adapted Andreas. And yeah, this is a continuing of the same passage. Okay, there are lots of technical details here. I will not talk about it. Just to mention one point. So this passage says that the cycle of Aias and the cycle of Andreas do not match for so 8 times in 500 years. And it is interesting that we have evidence from Michael the Syrian for a couple of conflicting Easter dates in the 7th and 8th century. And it seems likely, but it depends on well, it needs some exegesis, but it seems likely that this reflects conflicts between, or that some people used a cycle of Andreas, and that others used, for example, the classical Alexandrian cycle. So this may so these Easter cycles may have had a bit of an afterlife, but there's very little evidence. But the evidence there is suggests that it is possible. And then finally, why? So this conflict in the 560s is important, not just because that it will bring Andreas and Aias to Armenia, but also because it starts a very intense phase in Constantinople about adjusting the Easter cycle, adjusting the Annus Mundi era, which will lead to the establishment of the Byzantine era. So we have, in the space of about a century, we have 4 preserved discussions of the Easter date. There's the Paschal Chronicle, which starts with that, and there is some fragmentary evidence like that of Hieron and Aias, which shows that this was a very intense moment. And this all starts with this with the debate of the 560s, and this also ensures this is the moment that Aenianus becomes popular, and that his system will at some point be called by Maximus Confessor as the standard system. But that is a consequence of these debates of the 560s. So rapidly, a few conclusions, a very magisterial. What I have learned from working on this is that we should try to avoid narrating sort of linear histories of literature, by which I mean that so far the assumption has been very clearly for Aenianus. So Aenianus writes, and then as a consequence, he must have had an impact, and we start reading the evidence of the 5th century in function of an impact of Aenianus. But if you look at the evidence, there is actually no impact. The same for Andreas. Andreas, very interesting, he writes in the 350s, but he owes his survival in the first place to the rediscovery in the 6th century. And my hunch, but it's only a hunch, is that actually Aias in the 560s started looking for somebody who would give him arguments for the 6th of January as a Christmas date. And there are actually very few chronographies who actually do, because the 25th of December is, for example, also adopted by Aenianus. So there's very little evidence to start from. So it may well be that Aias digged Andreas up in a library and then gave him his afterlife. I hope to have shown that we can't narrate the history of Greek chronography just based on fully preserved texts, and the way the Armenian narrative distorts the presentation of Andreas and what happened in the 560s is also a good reminder of the importance of, well, the danger of backward-looking accounts. So that was very brief, very very schematic, but I hope it gives you it raises your interest and whets your appetite to maybe dig through the 150 pages that this will have in the book that will appear hopefully next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor van Nuffelen, for a wonderful presentation. I am sure that many of us here are eager to continue the conversation with you, and I'm glad to open the floor for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand. It's also possible to write down questions in the chat, and we can see them and read them for you if it's necessary. And perhaps, if I may, I could ask a very brief, fast question. You revert to, in addition to the Greek and the Armenian material, also to a Syriac reception, but that it is unconnected to the debates, to the arguments. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about how you see this?
Yes, so the mentions of Andreas come up, I think, in Jacob of Edessa, is just mentioned, and then Elias of Nisibis, who also collects lots of material on chronography. So he cites that treatise. So it seems that knowledge of the existence of Andreas was available in the Syriac tradition, that Elias did the effort of sort of looking it up. Although in Elias it's made up of a set of excerpts, so it's not a continuous text. So that may suggest that there is some intermediary there. I would still think that Andreas made it into the Syriac tradition also only in the 6th century or later. I think we speculate a bit whether we could attribute this to Andronicus, so also a fragmentary Syriac chronicler writing in the 6th century, but that must remain speculation.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting to hear about how authors and texts could be reactivated in later times for polemical consensus. The next question is by Michiel Debier.
Thank you very much, Peter, for his presentation, and looking forward to reading the book afterwards to have more information about Andreas and other writers. I have a question about the reception. You mentioned that he was read again during a controversy. So do you imagine that people had access to his work and that they read it, as you said, in a library, and then where? Was it in Antioch, in Constantinople? Where did the controversy take place for the most part? And do you think that it has implications for the circulation of the text, perhaps in extracts, explaining why we have only some small pieces of evidence about his work, just as we have when controversies deal with dogmatic issues, where extracts of authors, and I think of the work done by Georgia on historiography. Could it work the same way? I mean, when we have extracts, we can imagine that they were produced as evidence, but the whole work of an author wasn't read or wasn't copied or transmitted. Do you have any idea about how it works?
Yeah, thank you a lot. So where? That's indeed an interesting question, because so Aias is called Aias of Alexandria, and the Armenian sources assume that it takes place in Alexandria, but Aias also has the reputation of gathering people from all over the East, so experts, bring them together. So theoretically, any of, if this is true, which any of them could have brought all the relevant sources that they might have had access to in whatever way. So Alexandria seems to be an important sort of a hub. It's clear that the material traveled to Jerusalem, because that's the connection to Armenia. There is also an assumption in the Armenian sources that at some point Constantinople gets involved. So Heron is located in Constantinople, and that is interesting because I would think that this is about the period that Anianas travels from Alexandria to Constantinople. That seems, yeah, that seems like so. The question how Andreas from Antioch gets in the hands of Aias in Alexandria, good question. So I'm not excluding the possibility that the work of Andreas circulated before and might have ended up in Alexandria before, but clearly nobody read it, or at least there's no trace of him having been read or used. So I might just go with the hypothesis of sort of people bringing the material that is useful, that they think is useful in the discussion, and this generating new circulation of text that had been gathering dust in the library. The question of the form extracts, so that is an interesting one, because there is a hypothesis that Anianas and Panadorus only traveled in the form of extracts to Constantinople. There, except for Elias of, so it's clear the Armenian tradition has access to the full, but it's not a very long discussion, but the full discussion of the Easter date that preceded the Easter table, but that's not very long. I mean, that would be 2-3 pages of text. Otherwise, this material is never explicitly connected with the chronographic material. So either these were two different texts, so the Easter table and the chronography, or they got separated at some point. But the extracts we have, so I referred to the fact that Andreas uses Hippolytus. So the fragment where we see this is fairly long. So it is 2 pages, something which is okay. It could still function as an extract, but it becomes fairly long. I'm working on the assumption that the Armenians had access to a full text, but you're absolutely right that is an assumption. I mean, it would also work with extracts.
Give the floor to Rodney-as.
Thank you. That's fascinating material. You mentioned an arrangement in 17 columns. What is the principle of that arrangement?
It's the central column gives the date of 14 Nisan, so the full moon date, and then the columns work outwards. So then to the left, so earlier would be a date for Lent, then afterwards to the right dates for Pentecost, and then the outer columns give sort of more basic structural information, the number of the year of the in the Antiochian era. So we saw the bisextile, etc. So this more sort of structural information that has to do with the year and then the broader place in the grander reckoning of time tend to be at the outer sides of the columns. So that's roughly the arrangement.
Thank you.
And Nashim, please.
Excuse me. Okay. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And I'm so happy that you are dealing with the topic, which is really seems was in the interest of the Armenians in the 7th century, and now also it's not so interesting for the world. But I just wanted to ask, maybe I missed something. Did you use the Anania Shiragatsi? Because he has commentary on Andreas calendar, and I think that's the most reliable source because he's from 7th century. So, and he is really very reliable. I mean, Kozern also, of course, but did I miss?
No, I think, well, we have definitely used Anania, so I'm not sure if I indeed showed a brief snippet from that. And so he is indeed important in the sense that he's the earliest attestation of Andreas in the Armenian tradition, together with the anonymous chronicle, some ascribed to Philo of Tirac. And it's interesting also that already in Anania you find that the traditional narrative of the conflict between Hieron and Aias, and the errors that are made by Andreas and so on. So actually virtually everything that we find later in the Armenian tradition is already there. So about the narrative of the reception of Andreas. So he clearly seems to be the origin of that narrative. But you're absolutely right. He is an absolutely crucial source.
Thank you.
I give the floor to Charles Nave, and after that I will read a question from Adriaan in the chat.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I just have a couple of quick questions. First, what is the basis for the date of 353 that you have proposed? And second, are you saying that you believe the work was written in Antioch, or did I misunderstand?
Yeah. So 353 comes from the fact that the sources say explicitly that the 200-year list ends in 552. So it must have started in 353, which is also the logical starting date because it is the end, the first year after the end of the 95-year list of Anatolius of Laodicea. So Andreas is clearly somebody who is, so it's not just about polemicizing against the Quartodecimans, etc. There is simply a perceived need for a tool that helps the ordinary bishop to know when Easter will take place. And contrary to what we might think, so the 19-year cycle where you have to calculate the date yourself and you have to know in what year you are, that's a tool that is not very much favored by, let's say, ordinary bishops. So if you have this list which says in the year, okay, they didn't use AD years at that time, but if in the year AD 354, Easter will be on that Sunday, etc. That's easy to use, etc. So 353 is based on that, and then the location in Antioch. Antioch itself is not necessary. So it's this broader Syria where the Antiochian era is used. So that's an important argument for locating him there, and the other argument is then the polemic against the Syrians. We have speculated a bit about who his brother Magnus would be. There is actually Magnus, a bishop of Chalcis, so in Syria. So that might be, so in the right period. So that just might be the brother of Andreas, but I mean that's speculation. But yeah.
Thank you. Could you repeat just that it's 200 years since what?
The 200 years of Andreas, they start in 353 because we know that it ends in 552. That we know for certain, and so it is a continuation of the list of Anatolius that ended just a year before in 352.
Okay, thank you.
There is a question from Adrian Bertia in the chat. He is also asking about the role of Bishop Magnus. And he says, do we know anything else about him? The reason I ask is because in the so-called Syriac canons of Marutas, it is certain Magnus the Alexandrian to whom a chronicle is attributed. One can assume this refers to the same word, but maybe not. Adrian is asking.
Okay, that's great to know. I will look this up immediately because I didn't know about this Magnus the Alexandrian. So the thing about this Magnus is that he is sometimes called a bishop, not always. So when I was referring earlier to him being possibly identical with Magnus of Chalcis, that's on the assumption that the reference to Magnus the bishop is correct. I would have to think and look at the context of this Magnus the Alexandrian, because that would indeed be very interesting. Okay, great. No, yeah. So I can't say more at this point, but thank you very much for this reference.
I will give the floor to Georgia for the next question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this rich presentation. I have a question that also connects to one of the last answers you gave, and that is about how older polemics sometimes resurface and get utilized in different contexts. So I was wondering whether in the resurface of this text, the polemics against the Jews, the Syrians that celebrate Easters as the Jews also gets new light, or if there is something that just stays there.
Not as far as we see in the fragments. So it's not okay. These anti-Jewish, anti-Quartodecanon polemic keeps on being quoted, and it is a staple of Easter discussions. Although it is there are lots of, unsurprisingly, in the wake of Nicaea, we have several texts that actually refer to or use that polemic. But there, as far as we can see, there is no, I mean, things that you could expect is that for example, Aias would claim that Hebron is following the Jewish date, and there is a bit of that, but it's not very important. But these Easter discussions always turn on the question, who is following, well, those who are not following the established, say, Orthodox date, they are very easily assimilated with the Jews, but that's a very standard topic in Easter polemics.
Thank you.
Federico, in collaboration with Nina, I believe, please.
Yeah, exactly. Which she's also the reason why I'm asking now. Thank you very much for the presentation. You mentioned you mentioned a possible later interpolation when there is this Easter cycle that goes to the year 1400, right? And then in that context, you mentioned the 11th century. Did I hear correctly? Because unfortunately, the lady here did not allow me to hear very well, because I guess he's using the Alexandrian era. Do you have elaborated some possible context for such an interpolation, if that's the case? Because the issues with Armenian calendar, Hovhannes Kozeren, Hovhannes Sarkavag, etc., in the following century might be an interesting context for that.
Thank you. I think I should have said the 15th century, because so it's the Antiochian era. So 353 is here, 400. So plus 1,000. So then you're in the middle of the 14th century, which is roughly the date or the century of the manuscript where it comes from. So this is and what seems to have happened is that in the list of Andreas, the Antiochian era is sort of the point of reference to count the years, and so they just kept on counting. And I think that in some manuscripts this becomes called the year of Andreas, because they've ignored that this was the Antiochian era, and so they simply call it the year of Andreas. So it is basically just a tool to keep track of the years, which they, of course, and you know that the Armenian year was a movable year, so that makes everything slightly more complex. Everything that has to do with time reckoning slightly more complex in Armenia. And then to the point you say, so it is clear. So the evidence for Andreas comes in the Armenian tradition comes with peaks. So we have the 7th century Anania, and then it's basically the end of the 10th, 11th century when there is another peak. So, and it always has indeed to do, it's contemporaneous with efforts to bring order to the Armenian calendar and time reckoning. And then they go back looking to what is the material that we have, and how can we bring our calendar in line with say the Julian calendar and etc. So the evidence is or the temporal spread of the evidence is very closely linked to this interest in the Armenian tradition.
Thank you.
If there are no further questions, I propose that we thank Peter van Nuffelen for a very rich presentation and for demystifying the figure of Andreas for us. And I think we all look forward to the forthcoming book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining. See you next time.